Good morning, Boker Tov. Welcome back to 10 minutes of Meaning. Please help yourself at Shayla Corner. Some slushes, coffee, and pastries. I want to thank our generous sponsors of our 10 minutes of Meaning, Marilyn and Michael Fedak. Thank you so much for all of your generosity in so many ways. We are on the second parak, chapter 2 of Tanya. In chapter 1, we learned about the Nefesh Bahami, the lower level soul that we all have. And then Nefesh Parak Beis begins with Nefesh Hashenis B'Yisrael. We spent significant time talking about why is this our second soul. If it's our foundational primary soul, why does the Baal Tanya formulate it as our second soul? Is it chronological? Is it for some other reason? B'Yisrael, it's uniquely Jewish, and it is the Chelek Alakah Mimal Mamish. It is the literal piece of Hashem that we have in us. As we search for and look for confirmation, evidence of Hashem's existence everywhere in the universe and the world, all we need to do is look in the mirror. All we need to do is look into ourselves, because the greatest expression, the greatest presence of God, the greatest evidence of His existence is inside ourselves and the people around us. The Baal Tanya describes the origin of man, that God breathed life into us. And where did that breath come from? Kiviyachol, deep inside himself, like the glass blower, like the individual who blows a balloon. It's easy to get out of breath. Speech comes from the external. Speech comes from the superficial, the surface. That's why you're not out of breath from speaking. But blowing up a balloon could knock you out, because you take a deep breath inside yourself and blow into the other. Kiviyachol, the Ribono Shalom blew into us. Neshama, neshima, kol neshama talaka, kol neshima talaka. This is where it comes from. And we last left off, the Baal Tanya was telling us that we come from Kamosha ben Nimshach min Moach Ha'av, just like the child comes from the brain of the father. Kach kiviyachol nishmas kol ish Yisrael nimshcha mimachshav tov v'chachmaso yizbarach. Every Jewish person, every Yid is derived from Hashem through his thought and through his wisdom. We spent time, we won't repeat, you can listen last week, about how in antiquity, until the modern early period, they believed that the male seed was physically derived from cerebral matter of the brain. That it began in the brain, came down the brainstem, came down the spine, and then exited through a duct at the spine's base, and that's where we came from. And we shared Rabbi Steinsaltz's interpretation of the pituitary gland that stimulates reproduction. Maybe that's a modern application or way of understanding it. The Alter Rebbe himself understood it non-literally, because he writes that elsewhere. But even metaphorically, there's a notion that we come from the wisdom. So just like the child comes from the thought process, the intentionality of the father to reproduce, so we come from Kadosh Baruch Hu's thought. Iyu chachem v'lo b'chachma yediyah. Concerning Hashem's wisdom, the Tikkun Zohar says HaKadosh Baruch Hu is wise, but not with the wisdom as we know it. And we also spent time on this last week. We can't know God in His essence. It's not wisdom as we know it. The terms and descriptions we use for ourselves are not applicable to the infinite, omnipotent Hashem. Elohu v'chachmaso echad, k'mo shekasav Rambam. Right? In our case, wisdom is external to us. We have to acquire wisdom. We even use that in our vernacular, to acquire wisdom. You go to school, you sit in yeshiva, you learn, you download, you acquire the wisdom. For us, it is outside of ourselves, and then we internalize it by acquiring the wisdom. When it comes to the Ribono Shalom, the Almighty, hu b'chachmaso echad, shu amada, hu hayodea. The Rambam says, unlike human beings, God is simultaneously the Mada, the Yodea. He's the power to know, the knower, and the known. That idea of a wisdom that's entirely integrated with an essence is beyond us. We can't know that. Because we exist independent of knowledge, we can be ignorant and then acquire the knowledge. But Hashem and knowledge are one. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do we describe that? That's outside the realm of our experience. We can't. The Baal Tanya is explicit that there are things that are outside. Now, he has a Haggah, he has a note. And I was debating, what's the minhag? Are you allowed to learn Tanya without going into the note? You have to read the note. Otherwise, you can't make a siyum at the end. So in 100 years, when we make our siyum on Tanya, if we want to be able to say the siyum properly, then we have to read the note. So we'll read the note. Haggah, the Tanya cited the Rambam. And he quotes the Rambam to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his wisdom are one. The problem is that the Rambam is not the final word, or the only word, I should say, on this. The Rambam is following a certain school of Jewish philosophy, but he's not following the mystical approach, the approach of Kabbalah. V'hodu lo chachmei Kabbalah. In this instance, the chachmei Kabbalah would agree with the Rambam. But Pardes Meharamak, Rav Moshe Cordovero writes in Pardes, even according to the Arizal, even according to the Holy Ari Luriana Kabbalah, which is the primary source of Tanya as opposed to Rav Moshe Cordovero, nevertheless, they would agree with the Rambam in this case. What's the disagreement? The Rambam says HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his knowledge are one. How and where would Kabbalah disagree with that? Because Kabbalah focuses on the notion of the Or Ein Sof, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a infinite light. So Hashem's knowledge, according to Kabbalah, is a mere emanation of that light. There's a light that is greater, that is more abstract, that knowledge is the disseminated, sort of reduced part of, but there's something bigger and something greater. So when we say Hashem and his knowledge are one, as opposed to the human who needs to acquire that knowledge outside of ourselves, so that seems inconsistent with Kabbalah. The Rambam sees Hashem. What is Hashem's essence? Knowledge. That's why the Rambam, the great rationalist, how do we know Hashem is knowledge? How do we love? The Rambam writes in Torah, the mitzvah Avas Hashem. How do we fulfill the mitzvah to love Hashem? Is through knowledge. For the Rambam, it's all about knowledge. But Kabbalah says there's an Or Ein Sof, which is even above knowledge. So how does that shtim? How do you reconcile the opinion, the approach of Kabbalah with the Balatanya here endorsing the Rambam that seems at odds? So the note reconciles it. Pesod has palabshus Or Ein Sof Baruch Hu aydei tzimtzumim rabim b'kelim. It's not a contradiction because yes, there's a place and there's a level, there's an Or Ein Sof, there's this infinite light which Hashem is not reduced to knowledge. However, in the way that Hashem constricts himself to appear and be available and accessible to us, through that, in that keli, on that level, and through that finite vessel, Kadosh Baruch Hu is infinite Or Ein Sof. How does he fit in? How do we relate? How do we access? We're finite beings. We're mere mortals. So how do we, finite mere mortals, connect or access the Or Ein Sof, the infinite God? The answer is HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mitzamtim himself. He constricted, he restricted, he presented himself in that other way. So on that level and in that restricted way, his knowledge and he are one and the same. The Rambam's right. But at a higher level, then there's something greater, which is the Or Ein Sof, the Chachma Bina V'das. So Tanya suggests that the Rambam's description that Hashem as knowledge is true of the vessels, of the lower level, of the constricted form, when he wants to make himself available and accessible to us through Chachma and Bina and Das, which the Baal Tanya, as you can imagine, most certainly will explain more thoroughly. So where is all of that? Da Atzilus. In the world of Atzilus. Atzilus means emanation. So in that world of Atzilus, of divine attributes, we can see him and his knowledge as one and the same, but that is an incomplete description or view. At the higher level, he's the Or Ein Sof. Ach lo lamala me'atzilus. But the Rambam's assertion that Hashem is synonymous with knowledge, with das, is not correct above Atzilus, in a place of Or Ein Sof, at that higher place. So in conclusion, the Tanya can say, we can quote the Rambam here, and it's not at odds with Kabbalah, because it's talking about two angles or two perspectives or two descriptions. From the highest place is the Or Ein Sof, but from a lower, where he makes himself available, accessible in the Kalim to us, in the world of Chachma Bin and Das, so there we can see he and knowledge are one and the same, that we can describe him as his knowledge. That's the Hagah, that's the footnote. Back to our regular scheduled program. Back to what the Balatanya was trying to make a point. So that is all part one of Perek Beis. Part one of Perek Beis is our second soul, and the second soul that we have is Ribono Shalom manifest, expressing himself in us. Now that's very hard for us to relate to or identify with, because what do you mean Hashem is in me? Well, am I taken over by some ghost, taken over by a dibuk, taken over by some... I'm me. My autonomy, my initiative, my decision-making, my free will. Like, I'm me. So what does it mean? Achelek elokah mima'al mamish. Hashem is me. So we have to realize that I and Hashem are the same. The Baal Tanya doesn't say this here in Perek Beis, but there's a big notion. The Hasidic Sfarim focus a lot on the concept of bittul hayesh, the idea to nullify our sense of self to the godliness in us, that there is no conflict, there is no tension, there is no static between the two. that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is expressing himself through me, that my creativity, my entrepreneurship, my talent, skills, and brachas, my personality, who I am and everything about me, and my mission and purpose in this world is the manifestation and expression of Hashem. So yes, there's the lower soul, that, again, the animal in me that I'm not trying to slaughter or kill or purge, I'm trying to train and elevate. There's the animal in me, animal impulse, animal instinct, the physical, material world that we're learning how to navigate, a world of time and a world of food and a world of intimacy and a world of physical. That's the lower level soul. And then there's the higher soul, the essential soul, the eternal soul, which is the manifestation of Hashem in me. And now the Baal Tanya turns to continue to say, and not all these souls are equal. When it comes to that higher soul, the godly expression in me, there are tens of thousands of different levels of souls. One higher than the other. The Baal Tanya here is referencing a pasuk in Koheles. Baal Tanya was a Baki, Nigla, Nister, Tanakh, Chazal, everything. So he embeds references that you have to be far from equally knowledgeable, but you have to be aware of, to know what he's embedding, where he's drawing from, what he's saying in passing that become his vocabulary. Tanakh is his vocabulary. Gavoa me'al gavoa le'inkates, pasuk in the 5th parak of Koheles. So this is the idea that, on the one hand, Hashem put a piece of his soul, a piece of himself, in each and every one of us. On the other hand, it doesn't manifest equally. There are myriad, tens of thousands of different levels that expresses. Kimo, Goda Malas Nishmas Avas Moshe Rabbeinu Aleim Hashalom, Al Nishmas Dorasenu Eila de Ikve Meshicha. So you're not going to suggest, I'm not going to suggest, that Hashem breathed his life into me and Moshe Rabbeinu. So where is Zel Bazach? Moshe Rabbeinu and I are the same thing. We're both a chelek elokami ma'al mamash. Both of us have God in us. You shouldn't either. We're not equal. Me and Moshe Rabbeinu. We're not equal. Me and people in this room are much greater than I. Gedolei Yisrael are much greater. So what is this? Some democratization of neshamos by saying that we're all a chelek elokami ma'al mamash. It's almost like lahavdil, adas korach. We're all equal. We're all chelek elokami ma'al mamash. So Korach comes to Moshe and he says, who put you in charge? Who says you're any greater? Who says you get to legislate and teach Torah? We're all equal. So is that what we should think? The beginning of Perek Beis should teach us we're all equal? So no, Perek Beis continues and says, whoa, relax. Take a deep breath. Yes, we all have Hashem in us, but the way he appears and manifests, we're not all equal. We're different. Moshe Rabbeinu and the neshamos of our generation, which are Ikvei Meshicha. What's he using that language? Ikvei Meshicha is a lashon that comes from the Gemara in Sota that tells us and predicts what the world will be like in the Ikvas of the Mashiach, in the footsteps, the heels of Mashiach, when we're at the end of days, where we see the light at the end of the tunnel, we're close to the finish line, Mashiach's coming, which, by the way, we see many of those signs today in our time. We're living, halavai, Mashiach should come today. So the Baal Tanya is invoking that language of Ikvei Mashiach. What's fascinating is, when did the Baal Tanya live? What century? He lived several hundred years ago, and already then he's calling it Ikvei Mashiach. Every generation hopes, longs, wants, wishes it's Ikvei Mashiach. So it occurred to me, like we think, we look at the world, we see things happening, the modern miracle of the state of Israel, the challenge that come with it. But several hundred years ago, the Baal Tanya also felt Sheim Bechinas Akvayim Mamash Lagabe Hamoach V'Harosh. The term foot, these souls literally have the quality of feet compared to the souls of earlier generations who were the brain and the head. Our great-great-grandparents, they didn't have AI. They couldn't speak into their phone and their car would pick them up. They didn't have voice recognition software. They didn't have video conferencing on their phone. They could talk to their children on 7 continents simultaneously. And yet, they were the head, and we are the schmutz in their toenail. We are the schmutz between their toes. I'm paraphrasing the Baal Tanya here. They were the brain and the head, and we are the feet. The smelly, ugly, fungus-filled feet. And they were the head and the brain. I have Otzar Chachma and Bar Ilan Drive, Art Scroll Gemara, more svarim than anybody, than any time. We've made such progress, advance. Maybe, in some ways. I showed an article yesterday about who says we're better off for that. The Kotzker Rebbe, my friend Reb Nechemia told me, the Kotzker Rebbe was once asked, if Shlomo HaMelech was the wisest of all time, why didn't he invent the train? If he was brilliant and wise, why didn't he invent the train? So the Kotzker said he did. He just understood how it could be used for bad. And when he knew that trains could transport millions of Jews to their death, trains could be used to destroy the world, he chose to not introduce it to the world. Sometimes being brilliant doesn't mean you didn't know how to do something. It means you did, but you chose not to because you understood the ugly underbelly of it happening. If we could redo a world and not bring the internet to it, knowing what we know now about its impact on mental health and happiness and relationships, with all the good that it brings, would we be better off without it? It's an interesting question. It's not a clear-cut answer, but it's an interesting question. So just because technologically we have so much more and we think we've advanced, we should never be mistaken to think we're bigger and we're greater. Says the Baal Tanya, they were the head and the brain, and we're the feet. And not only intergenerationally, meaning relative to previous generations, we have a Yeridas Hadoros, we have a decline and a descent, but even within a generation, not all are equal. Agabe Nishmas Hamon, Va'amei Haaretz. Are you going to compare the Rebbe and me? Are you going to compare Reb Moshe, Reb Soloveitchik, Reb Hutner, Reb Yankiv? You're going to compare Reb Elyashiv, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, Lahavdil, Yibadol Chaim Tovim Baruchim? You're going to compare Reb Shechter and me? Within each generation, there are enormous gaps between those who are the head and the brain and those who are the bottom of the feet. The Hamon, the masses, and the Amei Haaretz. And the Amei Haaretz. V'chein nefashos lagabe nefashos. So those distinctions and differences, that enormous gap, is not only true on the level of neshama, but it's true on the lower level of the soul, the level of nefesh. Even on the level of nefesh, there are enormous gaps. Ki kol nefesh klula mi nefesh, ruach u'neshama. As we know, every soul has three layers, the nefesh, ruach, and neshama. And there too, there are these gaps. Mikol makom shorish kol nefesh, ruach, and neshama kulam, mirosh kol hamadregos. So even though we look in this world and you've got some low-life, debased, animalistic, undeveloped, immature, unsophisticated ignoramus, and then next to him you have some Balmidos, Gadol Ador, steeped in Kol HaTorah Kula, and they're expressing and manifesting themselves entirely different, but what they have in common is the root of every Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama comes Merosh Kol, from the highest level of the soul. At Sof Kol Dargan Hamuluvash Beguf Amei Arts, the Kal Shebekalim, to the point at the very lowest level of the soul, and the Amma Aretz, and the most irreverent and unsophisticated and immature and undeveloped, Nimshach Mimoach HaElyon, Shi Chachma Ilah Kiviyachol. It flows from the loftiest divine energy, referred to as the Moach Ilah, the supernal brain or the supernal wisdom. And now the Baal Tanya will end with this, gives a mashal how to understand this. How to understand this. So what does this mean? On the one hand, all of us are Chelek Elokam Mima'al Mamash. We are all equally at Tzelem Elokim. God not only desires our existence, He is our existence, or we are His existence in this world. On the other hand, that doesn't mean we're all equal. We're very far from it. Yet, the inequality of us still shares a commonality that we come from the same place. What does that mean? Well, I'm with this. Coming back to the metaphor of the child who comes from the brain, either the pituitary gland or the decision-making part of the brain, whatever it means, metaphor or anatomically. What happens when a father contributes the sperm, the seed, that conceives a baby? That little seed, that little microscopic seed, is going to develop into the brain of the child, that incredibly impressive brain of the child, which is the center of the human being. But that same seed is also going to manifest and express itself in the toenail of the child. So what are you going to compare? The toenail, which could fall off, the toenail that you cut, the toenail which you don't need to have is not critical, to the brain? No, they're different. The brain is certainly more indispensable, more central. The brain is certainly higher than the toenail on the one hand, but on the other, the toenail and the brain both come from the same seed, the same drop of sperm. A 9-month gestation. The seminal drop derived from the father's brain is downgraded, transformed, and ultimately expresses itself as the nail. So there are within the generation the people who are the nail. They're the nail people of the generation. The ingrown nail, the fungus nail, the moldy nail. They're the nail people of the generation. Or the healthy, beautiful, manicured nail. They're the nail people of the generation. And they're the brain people of the generation. And on the one hand, we are honest in recognizing the difference between them, but simultaneously we see the beauty and the interconnectivity and the unity that they both come from the same place. Even the nail, the drop is only changed in how it's manifest, but it remains unified in where it came from. The brain and the nail are a zel bazach, they're one and the same. They come from the same place. In that way, they're one and the same. They have, on the one hand, everything in common, and on the other hand, nothing in common. And so, too, people in this world, there are different levels. And on the one hand, we have everything in common, the same origin and source, the Ribono Shalom, our Father, who essentially seeded us in this world. And on the other hand, there still are those differences between us. There's still all those differences between us. So that's what we'll, Amir Tashem, pick up with next week. Section 3 of Perek Beis, which is the soul of the leaders. So first we began with the unify, what we all have, the chelik l'kol mimah mamish, the differentiated souls, the toenail versus the brain, and then now the brain, what does that soul of the leader look like? Have a good day. It should be a day of besoros tovos, yeshuos, v'nachamos.